Good afternoon. Just going to there we go. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Writers' Festival. We're celebrating 25 years of stories, ideas, and conversation. My name is Sean Wilson. I'm the festival's artistic director, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's book launch for The Cold Edge of Heaven. Hello also to those watching from home. The land we're on, where I live and work, is the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, and I encourage us all to be mindful of the colonial reality of our nation state, even as we gather in the spirit of friendship, enthusiasm, and curiosity. I want to take a moment to thank our amazing volunteers and generous patrons. Without community, none of this is possible. Copies of Whit's book are available just outside those doors from our friends at Perfect Books. By supporting them, you support this city, you support publishers, you support our featured author, and you support the festival, as Perfect Books makes a donation to our children's literacy initiatives for each and every book purchased at a festival event. I'm tremendously honored to introduce our host, Madeline Alakkarialak. She's an Inuit born and raised in Resolute Bay, was only 14 when she had to leave home to attend high school, and then came here to Ottawa for her post-secondary education. She's traveled the world as a cultural performer and advocate for Inuit. Madeline spent years at the CBC as a reporter, host, and producer on radio and television. She joined Nunavut Tungavik, the land claims organization that represents all Nunavut Inuit, prior to her 4 years as the executive assistant to Nunavut's first female premier. Currently, Iqaluit is where she makes her home as a mother to her amazing adult children and a grandmother of 2. Please welcome Madeline.
It's funny how life takes you to the most interesting places. Just a quick introduction of who I am and how I know Whit. I went to have lunch with Her Excellency, who's been my role model my whole life, the first Inuk woman I saw on television who looked like me and spoke like me, Inutitut. And it changes a child when you're able to see the kind of people, your kind of people, were in places like television. And having worked at CBC Radio for most of my life, I started when I was 22 years old, single mom of 2 little girls. Fast forward, I now have 2 grandkids, 5 adult children, and here I am in front of all of you introducing a good friend of mine, Whit. So at lunch today, Whit asked me, do you remember how we met? It was in the 80s. I remember, and I had just told Mary this. I said, I remember when I met Whit. I said, it was 1986, and I think you were doing some reporting in the high Arctic. Greece Fjord, I think it was, you were passing through and you came to my house. And he said, I asked him what it takes to be a reporter. Little did I know I was going to end up traveling our communities as a reporter at CBC, and Sean introduced in my introduction. It's funny, I didn't realize that when you send a bio to someone, they read all of it. There's no editing. I'm Madeline Alakkarialak. I was born and raised in Hauswitok, second most northern community in Canada, for those who have not visited God's country yet. Desolate. My ancestors are from Nunavik. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the high Arctic exiles. My grandparents were forcibly moved in the 1950s in the name of Canadian sovereignty. So they're proud Canadians, first Canadians and Canadians first. My grandmother was very true to the Queen, and it was very hard for my family, who my mother was named Elizabeth, because that's how much my grandmother was devoted. But that just goes to show how you never know when you're a child where things are going to lead you. So walking around the residence of the Governor General, I was telling my honey when we were driving there, we were so nervous. What do we wear? And Whit responded, we just wear normal clothes. It's very nice to be here with all of you. Whit asked me if I would introduce him. I didn't expect it, but that's the beauty of life, is it takes you to interesting places. And I see familiar faces. Even someone came up and said, hey, I remember you when you were the morning show host at CBC North. The world becomes very small. In the case of Whit, it was very interesting for me to go over the book. If you haven't read it, I know you will. And I'm very honored that I was able to introduce Whit and his new book. But there was a lot of familiarity in there for me, given the fact that I grew up in the high Arctic. I knew the names of the people in the book. But Whit's always been someone very close to the Arctic and the North. And to me, as a figure, I asked you all those questions about being a reporter then. I told them when I walked into their residence that I have lots of more questions. So obviously, Whit's a role model for me as a journalist. I haven't written any books yet, but let me be right behind you, Mr. Author of Cold Edge of Heaven. He's definitely a storyteller. I'm sure he would love sitting around any table with him. I'm sure he'll write a book with lots of humor. He was throwing in some jokes, and he's the husband to someone we love very much as Inuit. As I mentioned, you know, when you're a young person who's from Canada, born and raised Indigenous, in my case, Inuit, a lot of things have happened to us in my lifetime, and I'm not 50 yet, but even in my lifetime, we've seen a lot of things. And yesterday, I don't know if you understand the significance of September 30th, but we were on stage yesterday remembering all the children who never came home from residential schools. Though these experiences haunt us, we always look for ways as Inuit to move forward, to learn from our experiences. And it takes allies like Whit Fraser, and it takes allies like people like you to understand our stories, to read about all the experiences that people that have come to the North and seen for themselves. In his first book, the memoir of his life, when he worked in the Arctic communities, and he's visited all of them, all the Inuit communities, we're really welcoming people. In every sense of the word. It is one of our values as Inuit to be welcoming, regardless. And sometimes I feel like that's a fault of ours. How you say in English, it's a blessing and a fault, blessing and a curse. Yeah. In this case, it's been a blessing when you can have a friend and an ally write stories about experiences and about people and names that you hear. So his first book, True North Rising, won the 2019 Northwoods Book Prize. And I hope you're fit and ready to travel with your new book after everyone reads it. As I mentioned, his career with the CBC has been a long one, mine too. I just left the CBC about a year ago. But to have Whit, who's also served as founding chair of the Canadian Polar Commission, they do really interesting work as well in the North, in the Arctic. He was the executive director of Inuit Kanatami, which I thought I knew like everything about him, or most things, or a lot of things. I didn't know that. That must have been a while ago. There's still, the Inuit Kanatami does amazing work in representing Inuit in all of the regions, because we span right across Canada from Northwest Territories. Mr. Kakfui, nice to see you. Welcome. Thank you for coming. From the NWT, Nunavut, Labrador, Nunavik, my grandparents were forced to move to the high Arctic from Nunavik in Inukjuak. So my grandmother made sure that I was true to my roots as a real person from Nunavik. So welcome. I had no idea I was going to be in a church today. I didn't. In front of all you people, but I'm going to introduce Whit Fraser to read from his book, and then I'm going to interview him. I'm going to ask him all kinds of questions. That little girl in me just is still here. Please give a round of applause. Whit Fraser, everyone.
Thank you, Madeline. Nakawamik. So, Whit, why'd you write the book? Well, so I could work with Madeline. I'm going to read two sections of the book and try and set the context for each, if you will permit. In the 1920s, the federal government used what's called human flagpoles as sovereignty markers and sent Mounties to the high Arctic. My trio, Will Grant, a Nova Scotian, Eric Zalapsky, a Saskatchewan Ukrainian, and Vincent Villeneuve from northern Ontario, got on a ship with Captain Joseph Bernier in July of 1924, encountered a horrible storm and great adventures, bound for Dundas Harbour on Devon Island on the eastern portion of the Northwest Passage. They'd been on the ship for a month or more, and finally land was in sight. Their inspector, Ransom O'Halloran, summoned the Devon Island Patrol on deck. The government man, Craig, was with them. The ship was a mile offshore, still steaming, but a vast rocky beach stretched out before them. It's not really a harbor at all, thought Will Grant. It's more like a sweeping cove, slightly sheltered on the east and west sides by sloping rocky points. Directly up from the beach, a wide mountain valley stretched as far inland as one could see. A stiff breeze was blowing. The sun had given way to overcast skies. Breakers were crashing on the shore. Will's upbringing on Shettabukto Bay in Nova Scotia taught him about wind and water. I expect it's going to be rough beaching a boat and all of that, he said. You're right, said government man Craig, but that's not the plan. That's to be the post, not the landing site. We'll land and offload in a little cove beyond that westerly point. A half hour later, the anchor dropped, and within minutes, 2 motorboats were lowered and they bobbed in the water, motors chugging and sputtering, Acadian motors, a sound Will found comforting. Will, Villeneuve, Zalapsky, O'Halloran, and 4 other Mounties were in the first boat, the Inuit, Pudlu, and Timoti in the second, surrounded by the first load of Huskies. They came ashore almost at the same time. The cove was sheltered and safe. Pudlu and Timoti led the chained dogs up the hill to the base of a 60-foot rock wall. There they staked out long, secure tethers and tied the dogs with several feet of chain, just enough to allow movement, but not contact or conflict. The Mounties quickly had the first load of crates on the shore and moved them well above the high water mark. The motorboat with 3 Mounties went back for the second load. Pudlu was about 150 yards further up the grade and he motioned for Will to join him. "Look," he said, "real old Inuit camp, long, long time ago." Poodle pointed to the rock circles in the gravel, on the flattened, mossy soil, the outline of tent rings. It showed where long ago someone had placed rocks in a circle to secure a skin tent. Many boulders were partially covered with decades or even centuries of mosses and blowing topsoil. Look at the mountain. Do you see the woman's face and tattooed chin? We call this place Talaruti. It took Will a few minutes to trace the rock shapes and shadows, but then the face became as clear as though it had been sketched. Incredible. People had been here eons ago. No Englishman discovered Dundas Harbour, just as Columbus did not discover North America. In our old stories, Poodloo said, we tell of the times when we believed that we were the only people in the world. Poodloo looked at the mountain's tattooed face. Will promised himself that he would take the advice he received from Captain Bernier just a few days ago. Bernier said, "Trust Poodloo, stand by him, he will never let you down." Bernier let him know that the Arctic people who had learned to survive in these harsh conditions sought shelter from the elements. But Will's government bosses were doing the opposite by challenging the elements. Survival here was secondary, being visible paramount. The Dundas Harbour detachment wouldn't be visible to those flying the Northwest Passage if it were set up in this sheltered cove. But on the exposed beach, it would be difficult to miss, especially with Canada's red ensign flying in the stiff Arctic breeze, and the name spelled out in high white letters like he had seen at Craig Harbour. A few days later, Naudla watched Mounties lay large flat stones for the cornerstone and foundation for the storehouse. Another 3 men followed with packs on their backs. Behind them, 4 more with another prefabricated wall section. Will carried a 100-pound bag of flour on his back. His legs were throbbing. This was his 4th trip across the Esker, and it was still early afternoon. With many hours and trips to go before bedtime, the fact that it was flour, though, made the load a little lighter. He enjoyed baking and thought of freshly baked bread and bannock. The bannock that northern people ate was the same recipe that he'd grown up with in St. Francis Harbour. The rifle shot startled him back to reality, causing him to lose his balance. He looked around. Everybody had dropped their burdens. They were looking in every direction, startled. Where had it come from? Had someone been shot? Will knew that sound. It was a high-powered rifle, and it was very close. A second shot echoed across the landscape. Since Bernier had dropped anchor, the west to east moderate winds continued pushing broken ice pans eastward. Two polar bears, unnoticed, had moved from the ice and onto the beach. Will's eyes swept across the beach, where the foundation crews stood bewildered. Then he looked beyond, toward the beach, and saw about 100 yards from where they were standing, a polar bear slumping forward. Its front legs slowly spread forward and outward. Its hind legs and quarters collapsed backward, leaving the bear sprawled and belly down dead. Will and the others looked beyond the first bear, closer to the shore, and watched a second bear stagger, then make a feeble attempt to run, but its heart was draining of blood. Its legs folded, and it dropped. On the little hill, up the beach, eastward, Naudla got to her feet. She had been lying on her belly, a bundle of furs under her, and canvas. When she stood and turned to the children, Piapik and Kutu, Will could see a high-powered rifle in her hand. She set it aside and hugged the kids. Along the beach stood more than a dozen shocked and grateful strong-armed men. Pudlu and Timoti moved quickly. Each ran to a downed bear. They stopped 10 feet away to observe, then moved closer. Will watched Timoti move a front leg with his foot and saw blood coming from the chest. He and Pudlu quickly confirmed that both bears were dead, both shot clean through the heart. They walked up the slope to join and congratulate Naudla. O'Halloran was the first of the Kadlunak, or white men, to respond. When he reached Timoti and Naudla's tent, he offered his hand and his gratitude. Pudlu translated, "You've saved someone's life. We are also very grateful." In a moment, all the other men on shore joined him, including Craig and his senior clerk. They too offered hands in appreciation and admiration. Will, Zalapsky, and Villeneuve joined the growing circle. Will saw a strength of character that he had never witnessed in his life. He'd never seen this in anyone. Naudla was calm and confident. She needed neither praise nor attention. The bears were a threat. There was no time to look for help. O'Halloran wasted no time in getting down to business. Desperate to show gratitude, he said to Naudla through Pudlu, "I want to buy the skins and pay you to make clothing for the detachment. A month's pay for each skin, and a month for sewing." That meant $30 in total. Will thought it fair, given that Pudlu and Timoti earned 50 cents a day each. Pudlu translated. Naudla smiled, raised her eyebrows, a gesture meaning yes. Will watched Timoti, who stood beside his wife, close. The kids were at his thigh. He was looking at her proudly, with unconditional love and respect. Will felt a pang of envy. He waited a few more minutes until the brass backed off, then left with Villeneuve and Zalapsky. He simply offered his hand and said one of the first words he had learned, "Nakawamik," thank you. Naudla smiled back. She raised her eyes, and she looked into his. It didn't last a second. But the glance jolted Will's heart. Will turned to Pudlu, gave him a friendly elbow in the ribs, and smiled and said, "I thought you were the best hunter." Pudlu enjoyed the joke. He laughed, poked his chest. Pudlu is the best hunter. Naudla is the best shot. Well, in this section of the book, a lot happens. Two Mounties die violently from gunshot wounds. There's both a convergence of cultures and a clash of cultures. One of the clashes, fueled by liquor and lust, leave the Inuit no choice but to leave. Will is now in his third winter at Dundas Harbour. He's alone. He continues to wonder if anyone will ever come for him. What if the ship that got him there, the ship that suffered that terrible, terrible storm where they were not nearly all lost, what if the great Bernier did not make it back south? Would anyone know where they are? This is what troubled him. This and being alone, until finally he's at the edge of insanity and caught between insanity and reality. He has only the dog that Pudlu had left him 2 years ago as company and as sometimes a savior. Physical breakdown locked step with Will Grant's mental collapse. He began trembling and coughing and went through bouts of persistent chills. Next book I write, I'm going to get my eyes fixed. And under the hides, he drifted into a half sleep and woke up soaked in perspiration. He knew that it was a burning fever. His mind flashed to the mystery that had killed Piapik and laid Zalapsky and Vivi and Timoti so low. Will woke from the delirium. The room was freezing. Inspector barked and scratched at the door to be let in. Will could not remember when he had let him out. He struggled to light the fire and change his clothes, wet from the hot sweats. He had no idea of the time. He hadn't wound either of his watch or the clocks. The temperature had changed, now only minus 36 Fahrenheit. Seasonal, he muttered to himself, but still so god-awful cold. He looked at the sky. No Arctic twilight for a few more hours. He waited to see some change in the morning light, and then guessed the time to be about 10:30. Will was not sure what had laid him low. Had it been cabin fever or germ fever? But he had recovered. His mind was clearer now than at any time over the past month, but his body was weak. He couldn't be sure when he had last eaten. Finally, the water for tea and porridge bowled. The room was gradually warming, and he set out to do the chores. He tended the dogs, brought in more ice, checked the storehouse, gathered staples, and found a pail to replace the frozen, foul, full piss pot. After about 2 hours, Will realized that the room appeared suddenly brighter. He looked out at a faint trace of light emerging in the southern sky, growing brighter by the minute, and then stretching east and west across the horizon. The sun emerged, a wedge between the ice and sky. The cold edge of the sun. Will declared, "I have crossed hell frozen over to the cold edge of heaven." The almanac that had been included in the detachment's meager library told Will that it was February 6th, sunrise 11:32 a.m. Between his illness and sporadic depression and despair, he had lost a week. He thought it was February 1st. For the first time in weeks, his spirits rose, back in step and sync with sun and moon. It didn't change the fact that he was living in a frozen void, but psychologically, there was again order in his small, solitary world. The next day, Will watched the sunrise with 6 husky dogs stretching out in front of him on a journey to nowhere, just a run across the ice for a few hours for man and dog to exercise mind and body, now back among the living and free. For Will Grant, the mission and sovereignty patrol had been finished. From here on, he ran the dogs and himself for physical and mental exercise. Every day, as daylight extended, his mind became clearer. He wondered what had come closer to killing him, the fever or the cabin. A westward trip towards the south of Croker Bay presented another Arctic delicacy, blue ice, a huge iceberg, freed from the glacier, but locked on a rocky reef, stood out against the mountains, the clear sky, and the endless ice-covered ocean. It was magnificent, a huge castle with sweeping, smooth columns, spires, and summits, all shaped and sculpted by wind and water. Will peered into the center at a deep, wide cavern. Your Majesty, you have opened your heart and soul. He was smiling, savoring the resplendent blue and turquoise at the center of the stunning grandeur. I can hear you calling, come, drink from my soul. In that instant, he was back with Naudla and Pudlu, remembering the excitement they had expressed when they found a similar offering on that first long expedition over this very route. He could see Naudla with her pails and hatchet, chipping away chunks of blue ice with Pudlu's encouragement and promise. We are going to have the best tea and water in the whole wide world. Will walked into the cavern as though it were a giant cathedral, his snow knife and kettle in his hands, like a high priest dispensing incense. And Naudla's face burned in his memory. She was as warm in his heart as was the tea in his stomach and the tin mug cupped in his crippled hand. An hour later, he sat on the komatik, still marveling at the magnificent sculpture that nature had placed before him. This one moment of perfect serenity and solitude was worth everything that he had endured in the past months. From there to there, Will has only 4 things on his mind: survival, Naudla, being with her, to what extent he is going to be held responsible or believed responsible as the only witness and the only person on Devon Island when the 2 Mounties were shot. Will he be a suspect? And of course, did Bernier ever get south? I'm not telling you any more. Thank you all very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.
I had lots of questions.
I spilled the water.
Oh, it's okay.
Move your chair.
That's okay. I'll get it.
Nothing changes, Mary. It's the same here as at home.
How do you feel, Whit? Congratulations, firstly.
Thank you.
Yes. That was really fun to listen to. I just have a few questions I'd like to ask you, and then if everyone here or anyone here would like to ask the author questions of your own, I'll open the floor to that. I'm curious as to what inspired you to write this book. Thank you.
Well, it's a long story. I mean, who gets to go to Dundas Harbour on Devon Island 5 times?
Wow.
And the first time was in the 1970s as a reporter with CBC North. And then Mary and I together began doing some things with an organization called Students on Ice that takes a number of students to across the Arctic and as far as Greenland every year with marvelous program of education, and we had been invited to participate in that a few times, and that brought us to Dundas Harbour another 3 times at least. And then a small tour company, Adventure Canada, asked me to join them and talk about my previous book and gave me a day job as polar bear guard, along with several others. So we came to Dundas Harbour, and I took my place not very far from where the 2 Mounties and an Inuk child are buried, and I began to let 50 years of experience in traveling across the north merge and converge in my imagination, and I began putting together an outline of the book. In the meanwhile, a polar bear sat there and ate my lunch, and I didn't know the difference. But when I got back to the ship and when I got home, I said, I think I got a book. And here it is.
So what was interesting for me, and you say in the book that it's, I mean, I want to talk about the characters as well, but you label the book historical. I was curious as to which part of, I mean, there's a lot of familiar names.
Well,
it's fiction and nonfiction?
It's both. It's historical fiction. It's based on the facts. Fact one, the federal government in the 1920s tried to assert sovereignty by putting Mounties, human flagpoles, in high Arctic locations. That's what they did to assert sovereignty, rightly or wrongly. Joseph Bernier, who took all of those Mounties north, is arguably Canada's most experienced and successful Arctic explorer, although he got probably less attention than anyone else. Those parts are fact. There's characters in the book that appeared from good luck. I had to bring the character out in 1927. Now I've let you know he survived, or maybe he's body, but we had to bring Will out in 1927. There was only one ship called the Beothic, and its manifest is very easily defined on internet, and it had Dr. Frederick Banting, the discoverer of insulin, and A.Y. Jackson of the Group of 7 on board. They were part of Canada's sovereignty issue too. People who could talk to the rest of the country about the Arctic, because we didn't have television or any of that. So these were important elements of sovereignty. So those things are historically accurate, I believe. The deaths, the avalanches, all of the rest, that's the fiction part. That's what merged together in my mind. Adventures with polar bears and all of that. Some of them are based on some elements of adventure, but those are the differentiation points. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, thank you for noting that. What's interesting, Whit, is that as Inuit, I've heard we are the most studied people in the whole wide world. Where did this need to write about Inuit or include them in your book? Why was it important to you?
Look, I'll say before the question's asked, I'll say there's a little piece of me in Will Grant. Look at the people that I have had friends over the years, including yourself. Josie Kusagak, Jonah Kelly, Mary's family, Mary herself. I've been very close to Inuit for a long time. And I heard stories, and I knew people, other friends. one of the Mounties that we were with not long ago said, "Wow, I was stationed in Iqaluit a dozen or so years ago. Do you know Lou Phillips?" And I said, "Well, of course I know Lou Phillips." Well, he said, "You know, I learned so much from him. He's a great musician, and he taught me this, and he taught me that." There's a piece of Lou Phillips in Poodloo. There's the great leader from your community, Idlut. There's a piece of Idlut in that character. So there are a combination of many, many people that I met over the years, and the wisdom comes from Josie.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any favorite characters in this book?
All of them. All of them. Yeah.
Wow. This is just so...
Yeah, I have a favorite character.
Wait, okay, who?
Inspector. And I'm going to tell you the story of the dog, Inspector, because she's here. Little granddaughter, wave your hand.
Ah.
Higher.
Hi.
So granddaughter Selena was visiting us, and she was asking about the book, and I was maybe a third into it, and she said, "Well, Granddad, do you have a dog in the book?" Well, I said, "Geez, Selena, there's about 30 of them in there." No, she said, because she had come over to spoil our dog even further. She said, "Granddad, you need a dog. A dog." So I found a spot where Poodloo leaves when they depart. Poodloo leaves a pup, so I wrote that in. And Selena, baby, the dog saved the book. Thank you.
I just wanted to know if you have a favorite part. I asked you if you had a favorite character or any favorite characters. How about favorite part of the book? Is that even fair to say, to ask? No.
I don't think it's fair to ask, but some people may be able to answer those questions. But I think a book is supposed to hang together. Every one piece hangs to the next and leads to the next, and it becomes a structure. And if you pull one out, the whole thing could collapse. That's why the dog was important. But there is a special one. There's a special section in the book, and again, it was one of these sections, things that it was a gift. And that's the thing that I found as I did it, was how many little gifts I got was doing this. As I said, I needed to bring Will back home, or back to south. All of the Arctic ships left or departed from either Quebec City or Montreal. But the Beothuk sailed out of Sydney, Nova Scotia. And so the Beothuk came back to Sydney. And in order for him to get from Sydney to Ottawa, to headquarters, he had to go by St. Francis Harbour. And there's a scene where he's in the boat with his brother Ed, who I see as my grandfather. Mm-hmm. And they're fishing where grandparents had fished for a long time. Mm-hmm. And his beloved niece, my mother, plays the fiddle. So, and I dedicated the book to my mother Louise, a storyteller, a fiddler, and a Grant.
Hence the tie. Okay. No, that was, I appreciate this. And I had, there was a part in there in the book that I personally loved. And it's the part where Poodloo says, "Look at the mountains. Do you see a woman's face and her tattooed chin? I grew up wondering what dallotiup imanga meant. And it was the tattooed woman's chin. And
Now, you have to go to Dundas Harbour.
now I have to go. You beat me to it, and I'm from the high Arctic. What would you like your audience and book readers to come away with your new book, Cold
That's a
Edge
good question, Madeline.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like everybody to just try and put yourself in any of the places in the North. Many of you have already done that. Many of you have been in the North many, many times. So if it takes you back, wonderful. If it takes you there for the first time because you've always wanted to go and couldn't, wonderful. But I think just to try and feel the place, that it's such an important part of our country. It's the people, all of the people, the beauty, and one thing I purposely did is I made sure that for all of the hardships that they may face and all of the dangers any of them may encounter, no one in the book is ever hungry, not for a moment, because the land had always provided. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to make that point. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope there's some questions.
Yeah, I'm sure many have questions, but thank you. If you want to raise your hand with a question, thank you. I was going to grab it. Nakomik. I don't know how many have read it yet, but yeah, just say your name, where you're from, and what question you would like for the author. Yes, you.
My name's Joanne. I live here in Ottawa.
Mm-hmm.
Is
Hi,
this
Joanne.
on?
Yeah, it's on.
It
We
is?
could hear you.
Okay. Okay. I have to speak into it. Okay, good. My question, when you're writing historical fiction, is it a challenge sometimes to know what you can play with and what you can't play with?
Sometimes. I can't be specific as to when.
No.
I can turn it around and tell you that as a reporter, writing nonfiction, that became a challenge too.
Yeah.
But I think what you need, what I did anyway, I've nothing but my own background to fall back on this. So, but I said, what can I be sure that I'm able to defend and feel comfortable in that? And then I said my fallback is the publisher that deals with these things in many books at many times, and the publisher, when he read the book, was comfortable that we were on very solid ground. So, but yeah, you do think about it, and one of the and where I was careful is how many words did I put into the mouths of people like A.Y. Jackson and Frederick Banting. And I had to be very careful on that. And so I was. So it's innocuous to say, you can be a good painter someday. You know. Banting, on the other hand, and another stroke of luck, I opened up the internet and found on September 7th, 1927, the front page of the Toronto Star, and you can all look it up too, has a big bold headline, Banting blasts government for treatment of Eskimos. So I was on good ground there, you know. But that's a good question.
It is a good question. Thank you for that.
I have one more little question, if that's okay.
Of course.
So when you came up with the idea sort of for writing this book, were you more thinking about trying to tell the story of the Mounties and them being shot? I assume that's a true story, is it? Is that true?
Two Mounties in real life Unfortunately, 2 of the 3 Mounties that went north at that period, one regrettably committed suicide, and another is reported to have accidentally killed himself on a hunting trip. So they did die by gunshot wounds. They did not have an Inuit family with them as guides. Some Mounties did later on, and that's where the imagination took over, and I arbitrarily decided that my 3 Mounties would have guides right off the bat, and I was including the guides as I was formulating the idea in my head. It was not going to be just 3 Mounties by themselves, because there are some things I wanted to include about the way we did sovereignty, and there's the odd rant from Will in there about how could 3 half crazed Mounties stake sovereignty and leave 1,000 lamps that burned every night in igloos mean nothing to sovereignty. And so he raises questions like that to the dog.
Somebody else up over on this side had their hand up. He's coming over with the microphone. I don't know, Sean, how much more time we have. We could take this question. Okay.
Thank you very much, obviously, Mr. Fraser, for your talk and your book. My name is Andrew Parks. I am a teacher with the OCDSB, and one of our goals, not only in previous years, but especially through Truth and Reconciliation, has been to include Indigenous stories and Indigenous history, be it historical truth or historical fiction, or through their own learnings into our curriculum. What I would like to ask is for a book that you've just released, or for any literature, would you have any recommendations on how I, as a high school teacher, would be able to better and appropriately incorporate these stories into my lessons?
Well, all I can say is if I hope and I think, and I'm getting a sense that all departments of education across the country are finally coming to terms with getting Indigenous studies into the classroom all the way through school. And I sure as hell didn't get it when I was in Nova Scotia schools in the 1940s and 50s. And I think that's happening. I cannot imagine what storyteller like myself would object if you used anything that I did or anything they did in their school. My sense is that people would be delighted and easily to give permission. And I see, and I've seen this traveling with Mary too, is that many of the places we've gone in schools is that teachers like yourself are way ahead of the curve from the departments of education and federally or provincially or territorially in developing curriculum. I see teachers struggling to put together their own class programs and encouraging projects and discussion groups among children, and I applaud you for that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That was, if I may, Whit, I think when people talk about reconciliation, this is the conversation, is asking where can we get, who do we talk to? How can I teach myself? How can I learn more about Indigenous people? How can I learn more about Inuit? And it's not an excuse to be ignorant anymore, because we're there. Inuit are the most studied people in the world. So obviously that the work that was done is out there. So it's taking that effort, it's recognizing that you want to learn more, it's recognizing that you want to understand more about the very people, the first peoples of this country. And that is a great start. And making sure the next generation of students don't have the same unfortunate situation where they didn't teach them that in school, you know? So thank you for your question. And if we don't have much more time, if we don't have any more time, Sean, I'm going to invite you for closing comments to thank everyone that came. I got it.
I got it.
That's what I'm here for.
No,
to help you.
I'm going to tell you one funny story before I close. It's about the polar bears. I went to one of the trips to Dundas Harbour with students, and we pulled up in the Zodiacs, and we're all ready to get out, and there's 2 polar bears, and one of them comes out of the cabin. So the kids didn't get ashore, but we watched the bears from the Zodiacs for some time, and the bears owned the property. They were meandering all over like dogs in the backyard and sitting down and watching us going back inside the old detachment. And the very next year, with Adventure Canada, they dropped a young fellow like me, the same age, John Houston, who's great experience in the north. So John and I got dropped on the beach to sweep the area and make sure there were no bears. And so we have to go inside the cabins. And we were looking at each other, who's going in and who isn't. And one is standing behind the door like this with the shotgun ready to fire, the safety off and ready to go. And another is throwing rocks on the roof and banging on the back wall. But on that trip, at least, there were no bears. But it was quite hilarious having seen 2 there the year previous. And coincidentally, 2 bears arrived in the book. But there's a couple of people that I really need to thank, and maybe I can take this time to do it. The first one is to my dear wife, Mary, and say what goes around comes around, Mary, because remember, it was 49 years ago that you helped me with spelling and translation at that very first formative meeting for the Inuit rights movement in Cambridge Bay 49 years ago. And how many times in the last year when this was being put together did I come to you again for help in translation and pronunciation and spelling? So nakawamik, my dear, Natalia Givigit. I want to thank Susan Osborne. I hope Susan was able to make it. If you are you here? Okay, hi. Thanks, Susan. I've got a book for you at the end. Don't buy one. Susan was on the last trip with me with Adventure Canada, and she's the resident historian. And with her great help, she kept me off the shoals with the historical timelines and facts, and I'd been in trouble without her. So thank you, Susan, very much for that. There's some old CBC colleagues, Dick Gordon, Alan Holman, Doug Ward, Red Sharon, and Marie Wilson. Thanks to all of you. I know Marie could be here today. Thanks for all of you for reading a very messy manuscript and confirming what I only wanted to know in the first place. You all said The Cold Edge of Heaven is a good story, and that's all the encouragement I needed, so thank you. And of course, now to the brightest star in the Northern Lights, Madeline, for taking the time to help me today with this launch. I really appreciate it very much. Finally got to work with her. I finally got to work with you.
I
So
finally got to work with you too. Congratulations. I'm very proud to be here. Thank you, Nakomik, everyone, for coming out this afternoon. And thank you, Sean, and all your people. It was beautiful. Different. I've never done this before. Check mark. You will be signing books.
I will,
You will be signing books. And
if anybody asks.
another round of applause to the author, Whit Fraser, everyone.
And thank you, Madeline, so much. I'll just warn you that Whit has been telling people you are going to write a book and has already been talking about, like he's been saying it's coming. So I hope the pressure is on. We can't
Be
wait
careful.
to read your book.
You might be characters
And I'll
in
just
it.
remind everyone, the bookstores out there, our friends at Perfect Books are very happy to sell you some wonderful books. I just read a disturbing study that half of all books bought are never read. And so I'm going to encourage everyone to buy 2 copies right now because I think you're going to enjoy this one. Thank you for being here, and Whit will be signing right over here.
Thank you, Sean.